So we're going to be talking briefly here about prokaryotic versus eukaryotic cells, okay? And here is a couple of pictures of a generic eukaryote, and here is a generic prokaryote. And the first thing that you should notice is that this one does not have a nucleus. It has something called a nucleoid. I'm not actually probably going to test you on nucleoid, but there is no nucleus inside this prokaryote. And inside this eukaryote, there's a bunch of stuff going on, in fact. And there is this nucleus here. And just for a little bit of context for you, when you look at the things that you see in life that are alive most of the time, most of those are eukaryotes. So you are a eukaryote. Your family are all eukaryotes. Your dog is a eukaryote. Your houseplant is a eukaryote. Prokaryotes are comprised of bacteria and another group called archaea, and they're very, very, very tiny. Prokaryotes tend to be much, much smaller than eukaryotic cells, and prokaryotes are all single cellular. So let's start talking about some of the details. Prokaryote means before the nucleus. Like I said earlier, it includes the bacteria and the archaea. There is a nucleoid region, but there is not a true membrane-bound enclosed compartment. So in your cells, there is a compartment called the nucleus, and that is where your DNA lives. Inside each of your cells, there are different organelles that help your cell to carry out cellular function. Prokaryotes do not have organelles. They do not have a nucleus or mitochondria. Okay, they're small size, they're typically single-celled, and they don't need oxygen. Those are prokaryotic cells. Those are the prokaryotes. Eukaryotic cells, or the term eukaryote means true nucleus, and again, you are a eukaryote. This includes the kingdoms that are not bacteria or archaea. So that's animals, plants, fungi, and protists. Within the eukaryotes, DNA is enclosed within the nucleus. It's enclosed within this membrane-bound organelle called the nucleus, and this kind of makes it sound like DNA is also within other organelles. It is not. DNA is just inside the nucleus, and other organelles are present within eukaryotic cells. So eukaryotic cells are they're multicellular. They can also be single cellular. They tend to be larger, and they sometimes use oxygen, although that's not necessarily true. Not all eukaryotes require oxygen to live. So this is just a table sort of summarizing some of those things. Eukaryotes, there's this center nucleoid region, but the DNA is just kind of floating around inside the middle of these prokaryotes. And the eukaryotes, the DNA is within this membrane-bound nucleus. Prokaryotes have a tendency to be smaller, and eukaryotes have a tendency to be larger than prokaryotes. This is not always true. There are prokaryotes that are larger than some eukaryotes, but generally this is the case, that prokaryotes typically are smaller. Prokaryotes are single-celled. There are some that will cluster together and do things like that, but generally prokaryotes are single-cellular. Eukaryotes are often multicellular, although eukaryotes can be single-cellular as well. Prokaryotes may or may not need oxygen, but if you see something that doesn't need oxygen, it's more likely to be a prokaryote. And whereas eukaryotes, you typically need oxygen to survive. This is not always the case, as with many things in biology. This is just kind of a generality. But most of the time, prokaryotes don't need oxygen and eukaryotes do. This one is not a generalization or a generality. Prokaryotes do not have membrane-bound organelles by definition. That is one of the definitions of a prokaryote, and that's one of the main differences. That's a big takeaway from this lecture, actually, is that prokaryotes do not have membrane-bound organelles, whereas eukaryotes do have membrane-bound organelles. If we're talking generally about a eukaryotic cell, there are 5 main components here. The nucleus, which houses the DNA, the organelles, which allow it to do different cellular stuff, which we'll talk about later on. The cytosol, which is just the internal water-like substance inside of the cell. And you may have seen cytoplasm, and we're going to talk about the difference between cytosol and cytoplasm later on. You have the cytoskeleton, which helps keep the cell up and supported, also has big roles when the cells start to reproduce and copy themselves, which we'll get to later as well. And it has the plasma membrane, which is the sort of outer sort of container for a eukaryotic cell. So in the next lecture, we're going to be taking a tour of animal cells, sort of starting with this idea of DNA in the center here inside the nucleus. And then we're going to go through the process and do sort of a preview of the creation of protein and how that process works. So that's for the next lecture.